Amanda from Pontes Books here with the Historical Tidbit for Chapter 17 of The Prince and the Pauper. Today's Historical Tidbit is kind of a fun one, albeit not necessarily exactly from the book, but loosely connected historically, if not exactly. So what we're focusing on today is Cockney rhyming slang. So in the picture here, you can see that there's bread and honey, which will relate to Cockney rhyming slang. It's probably the most famous phrase that comes from it, but otherwise not commonly known to people, at least in the United States, I would say. So the reference in The Prince and the Pauper, kind of where this inspiration came from, is this song that John Canty and his fellow thieves kind of sing when Edward meets them in the barn. So Bean Darkmans then, Bouse Mort and Ken, the Bean Coves Bings Awast, on chates to trine by Rome Coves dine, for his long live at last. Binged out Bean Morts and Tour, Bing out of the Rome vile bine, and tour the cove that cloyed your duds upon the chates to trine. Conversation followed, not in the thieves' dialect of the song, for that was only used in talk when unfriendly ears might be listening. So here we see an example of some sort of rhyming code, rhyming slang that the thieves are using in their song. But then we have this narration that follows it, where it talks about them talking kind of in normal wording, as opposed to in the song where it's thieves' dialect, and they only use that dialect when there were unfriendly ears that were listening. So it was something that they meant to be undecodable, something that they were talking in, a sort of secret language, so that they could talk about, whatever their criminal actions were without having someone find out what they were up to. So in terms of exactly what code they're using here, I couldn't really find anything specific, but I did find, as I mentioned, our topic for today is Cockney rhyming slang, which from looking at this song doesn't appear to be quite the same thing, because there's kind of some nonsense words that pop up in there too, which isn't really a component of Cockney rhyming slang, really. So I don't know exactly what code they're using here, but here's an example. Maybe Mark Twain made up his own and modeled it after this. I don't know exactly, but Cockney rhyming slang is what we're going to focus on specifically today, because there's some information about it that we can share, like I said, kind of historically. So what is Cockney rhyming slang? It's obviously a form of slang, a form of coded language that was mostly prevalent in the UK, Ireland, and Australia. So in fact, sometimes it's called Australian slang. So obviously this story doesn't take place in Australia, but it is also a prevalent kind of code used in the UK where the story does take place. So it was especially used in the criminal underworld. And the way that the code kind of works is that you would take a common word and you would replace it with a phrase of 2 or more words. And in that phrase, the last word would rhyme with the original word that you're trying to communicate. And then oftentimes, as these patterns kind of got picked up, that rhyming word was dropped, so that what was left was kind of this undecipherable code unless you knew what they were talking about. So I'll give some examples. So first we have Army and Navy translating to gravy. And one of the websites I found kind of gave some examples of maybe why they chose this phrase besides rhyming. Gravy was plentiful at mealtimes in both services, so they, I guess, needed a word for gravy, which to me seems like something that wouldn't need to be coded, unless gravy is kind of being used in a more modern context where we're talking about kind of money that you're getting. But in this case, I can't be positive if it was being used in a literal or figurative sense, but Army and Navy, gravy was the example of how they use that 3-word phrase, Army and Navy, last word Navy rhymes with gravy. Then we have another example of gravy, but now we have kind of another word that it means. Basin of gravy means baby, suggestive of the softness of the foods on which babies are fed. Interesting. And then lastly, another example, bees and honey, money. So work produces money. So again, more things could rhyme, and I'll actually give another example of another code that they could have used for money on the next slide. So hopefully you're kind of seeing how this pattern works, but I'm going to give a few more examples where we see that last word being dropped and see how it relates to the original rhyming phrase. So here's another example for money, and apparently this is the most common one, hence the picture that I chose. So bread is commonly known or understood to mean money, originally coming from the phrase bread and honey. So bread and honey rhymes with money, but they dropped that and honey and just said bread. And then it commonly came to be understood that that meant money. So then similarly, we have daisies, which originally was daisy roots, which means boots. And we have mutton. I like this one because it's Mutt and Jeff, but it gets kind of shortened to mutton. Mutt and Jeff is deaf, named after Mutt and Jeff, two early 20th century comic book characters. So that's a complex one if you ask me. And then we have Rosie Lee, which stands for tea, have a cup of Rosie. And then lastly, sky is shortened version of skyrocket, which means pocket. So you can kind of see the progression of the code and how it moves from these short phrases that rhyme to a single word that doesn't rhyme. That would be very hard to understand if you didn't know what they were talking about. So that's Cockney rhyming slang. That's one of the types of code that, you know, criminals in the UK could use. Whether that's exactly what Mark Twain was going for or not, probably not, but something